The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome to everyone. My name is Jeremy Sauter, and I'm the Associate Director of Membership at the French-American Chamber of Commerce. We are delighted today to host this webinar, the new BPIFRANCE Build Up International Fund, a key ally for US acquisitions. I'm happy to see that many members and guests registered for this webinar. Many of our 1,000 plus members are US subsidiaries of France-based companies, and some of them will come to the conclusion that an acquisition of an American company will be key to boosting American market penetration. Other members are mergers and acquisitions advisors. Other members are business advisors, be it on the legal or accounting side or more. So for all these members, the new BPIFRANCE Build Up International Fund can be a flexible and powerful resource to facilitate US acquisitions. For those of you who don't know BPIFRANCE yet, it is a France public investment bank working alongside private banks and investors to facilitate business expansion within and outside of France. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dylan Laurence Missonnier, the Build Up International Fund Manager, who is based in Paris but travels internationally to manage the fund's growth. And before I do that, I will just give you some housekeeping items. You will be able you are going to hear the presentation by Dylan. It's going to take about 20 to 25 minutes. And while you hear the presentation, you will be able to type in questions. Just look at the questions section of your control panel, which is on the right side of your screen. And after Dylan makes his presentation, Dylan will be able to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to switch to Dylan Missonnier, Manager, Senior Investment Manager of the International Build Up Fund.
All right, I hope everybody can see my screen. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for giving me the opportunity to present the International Build-Up Fund today. And thanks to every one of you took the time to join us today for the webinar. The International Build-Up Fund is truly a one-of-a-kind investment tool, and I hope it will rapidly edge its way through your projects or your clients' projects for the advisors in the room. In order to be able to answer to a maximum of your questions, I'm going to present the fundamentals of the fund and then make time to answer your questions. So as Jeremy mentioned, don't hesitate to type in your question within the control panel. So maybe the first thing that is key to really understand the International Build-Up Fund is to understand why it was created and who it was created for. So this fund, this investment fund of BPIFRANCE, it works as a traditional private equity fund. The difference is it is the only private equity fund of BPIFRANCE which invests internationally, and it was especially created for independent French businesses. So this is really important to remember that. So independent, when I say independent French businesses, I mean businesses which are majoritarily owned by individuals or families, as opposed to financial investors, such as private equity investors or corporate investor. The reason why we felt it was extremely important to focus on this population of companies is that these companies have a true international legitimacy because they often have an extremely competitive know-how, and they have every right to conquer the world. But at the same time, these independent businesses, these businesses which are owned by families or individuals, they tend to value their independence over their growth potential. It means that once these companies have explored all of their traditional financing options through loans, bank loans, the next logical step to finance their growth would be to welcome external investors within their equity. But more often than not, they tend to they prefer to stop growing instead of opening their capital. So the International Business Fund has been, Build-Up Fund has been created to find a solution to this problem. And the solution is investing alongside them, but not at group level in a foreign target. So for instance, if a French company decides that the next step to grow internationally would be to settle in the US market, and in order to do so wants to acquire a US company, the International Build-Up Fund would invest directly into the US company as opposed to inside the French company at group level. Therefore, the French company would remain entirely independent from a capital structure standpoint. The founders of the company, the individuals, the families which created and governed the company would remain the masters of the group strategy, but they would welcome us as a financial investor inside their foreign-based subsidiary, and that way would find another source of financing without compromising their independence at group level. So once we invest in a foreign-based target alongside a French company, we, as traditional financial investors, do remain by their sides throughout the investment horizon. And at the end of the investment horizon, which can be up to 8 years, because as a public institution, we have the capacity to stay longer involved in our acquisition than traditional funds would. But the idea is that at the end of the day, we, the International Build-Up Fund, will not sell our shares to a third party. We want the French company to buy back the shares that we invested in order to regain complete ownership of their subsidiary abroad. So maybe as a wrap up for this first explanation, the adventure always starts for us with finding a suitable French company, which means I will explain the suitable part of it right after this. But the first thing to do for us is to find a French company that needs our help. So it's a French company that wants to go abroad, but wants to remain independent at the same time. The next step is then, once we found this French company, is to look together at a foreign target. So this part is more traditional from an investment standpoint, because this is what every private equity fund does. This is the traditional financial due diligence, structuring of the operation part. And once this is done, as I was explaining earlier, we govern together throughout the investment horizon. And at the end of this horizon, we want the French company to buy back our shares in order to regain complete ownership of its foreign subsidiary. First important point that I didn't mention until then, we only invest minority stakes in these foreign targets. So we can invest up to 49% of within the equity of the foreign target, but we will always remain a minority investor. Now that I've explained how it works, I will go rapidly through the different criteria and conditions that need to be met in order to qualify for an investment from our fund. So first, if we start from the beginning, we look at a French company. There are three main criteria that must be valued and must be met in order to go further. So first, the French company, obviously, based on what I said earlier, must be majoritarily owned by individuals. So it must be an independent business. In terms of size, this is pretty large. So we welcome companies with revenues ranging from 20 million euros to 1.5 billion. In our experience, the companies which tend to meet all of the requirements are generally comprised between 100 million and 500 million in revenue. Beyond that, the companies that are bigger than 500 million revenue, they generally have financial investors in their capital, so they don't qualify for an investment from our fund. And below 100 million, they're usually not ready enough to go international, which brings me to my next point. We really want to assess whether the company we're talking with is truly ready to go international or needs to work a bit more on its corporate strategy before considering a foreign acquisitions. If those criteria aren't met, we generally reorient these companies within the BPIFRANCE network. For instance, if the company isn't an independent business, they still qualify for an equity investment of any other fund of BPIFRANCE. If the companies are not mature enough, we have dedicated teams at BPIFRANCE which help them develop their international strategy. So we always tend to find a suitable solution just so they can be ready later on for growing internationally. So that's for these are the main criteria that are related to the French company that we start working with. Then on the foreign targets, so these requirements are pretty standard. So obviously the foreign target must not be located in a country that is blacklisted as per BPIFRANCE standards, but this is not really restrictive. I mean, there's probably 10 countries that are blacklisted, which are located mainly in the Middle East or North Korea. So these countries are the most obvious ones, and we have hardly any other foreign restrictions. Then, and this is pretty traditional, obviously, when we look at a foreign target, we perform the traditional due diligences in terms of financial viability, from a tax standpoint, legal standpoint, and so on. So obviously, the general levels of profitability and compliance must be met. And the very last point is probably the most specific to the International Build-Up Fund, and it's really important. Since we invest in a foreign-based target, and since we want to exit our investment at the end of the investment horizon, the shares that we buy must be easily valuable. So it means that if the business that we invest in is part of a supply chain, it's not really going to have a value of its own. So, what I mean by that is that we really want the company that we're investing in abroad to be independent on its own market. So if, for instance, the wrong example would be investing, let's say we want to accompany abroad, a company that makes aircrafts, and this company wants to buy wing factory in the United States. The wings would only be a part of the aircraft, and therefore, when integrated at group level, it would not really have value on its own. So it's really important that the business that we're looking at has a standalone existence on its own market. So that's probably the main and the most, at the same time, difficult criteria to analyze for us. And finally, in terms of our investment, we will, as I said earlier, always be minority investors up to 45%. And in terms of amount, we can invest. We have the possibility to invest up to 30 million euros per project and per client. So if we accompany abroad a French company, and this company has 3 acquisition projects, we can either invest 30 million in one big acquisition project or invest 3 times 10 million. So 10 million in each. So each company that we're working with has an envelope, if you will, of 30 million euros to use in one or several strategic acquisition internationally. The second point, which I mentioned earlier, is that we are minority investors, but we really want to be involved in the board of the company abroad as a traditional private equity investor would. So along with our investment come 1 or 2 board seats and certain veto rights on key business consideration. And in terms of duration of our investments, as I mentioned earlier, we can be pretty flexible. So it's really up to the French company that we accompany. But I would say that on average, we expect our investment to last for 5 to 6 years, but they can last for up to 8 years or less than 5 years if the French company wants to rapidly regain full ownership of its foreign target. Now going to illustrate this, I'll present a recent success story that we had in Poland. So this is the first investment that was recently completed by the fund. So we met in about a year ago with a French company which had identified as the next big strategic step for its development, the Polish market. And it had identified a strategic target, which was the Polish leader in Poland. So we then decided to study the opportunity together. So we met with management, we launched due diligences on the Polish target. And after consideration of this opportunity, we both decided that it was worth investing in, and we took a minority share of 20% in the Polish-based target. And after that, in conjunction with this, we negotiated board seats, veto rights, the terms of our liquidity throughout the investment horizon, throughout the partnership that we have with the French company inside the Polish target. And we have an option. The liquidity part of our investment is really important, and we've agreed that in 5 years from now, we would have, they would have an option to buy back our shares, and if they don't after 5 years, we would be able to force them to buy back our shares after 7 years. So we really put something in place that would guarantee that the French company would buy back our shares and remain and recover full ownership of its foreign investments. Observation. So the reason why we particularly felt with Jeremy that it was relevant for us to organize a webinar today is that as of today, we've met with over 100 independent businesses in France, and in almost 50% of the cases, they are extremely interested in entering the North American markets, and especially with an end goal to penetrate the United States. So I believe that, for instance, as of today, we have 3 serious operations that we're looking at in the United States, and it keeps flowing in. So I believe there is truly a very strong and tangible interest for these independent businesses for reaching out to North America and especially the US. The other market, big market that is of interest to these independent businesses is Central and Eastern Europe. So usually when we I mean, over 75% of the time when we meet with a company, we know now for sure that they will either want to penetrate North America or Central Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. In terms of sector, it is important to specify that the International Build-Up Fund has hardly any restriction. The only sectors that we will not want to invest alongside are banking, insurance, and real estate. But other than that, we are open to a lot of, to every other sector. But in general, the sectors that are most represented within the pool of over 100 companies that we've met so far are food and farming, construction goods, high-end industrial goods, and to a lesser extent, service to corporates and health and slash pharmaceutical sectors. So I hope the previous slides were clear enough, but now I believe it's time to answer your questions regarding the fund, and I'm happy to share experiences or specify any technical aspects that maybe I felt were a bit too complicated for this overview. So now it's up to you. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Dylan, for this very clear presentation. And I am glad to see that we got a good number of questions from the audience today. So I will start with a first question. How do you set formula for buyback of your shares at the end of the 8-year period? What happens if the French company cannot refinance the purchase?
That's a very good question. Thank you very much. As you may imagine, this is really on a case-by-case basis. So for instance, if I look at the deal that we recently completed in Poland, this is on a fixed multiple of EBITDA basis, but it could be an internal rate of return basis. So it's really, generally speaking, the IRR is not the favored mean for the independent businesses to close deal with us. So we're generally looking at multiple-based exit formulas, but there can be many options. Regarding the second part of the question, internally, when selecting the French company that we feel it would be interesting to work with. A key consideration for us, without necessarily launching a full due diligence on these French companies, is to make sure that in light of the size of the investment that are going to be made internationally, they will be able to buy us back. So generally speaking, we dedicate a good portion of our investigation to make sure that something like this will not happen at the end of the day. But on the off chance that something like this would happen, well, there could be many different ways, but of dealing with this. Maybe the easiest way, and this is what we managed to negotiate with the operation we made in Poland, is to swap our participation, our stake in the target at group level. So we would, if the company would not be able to pay us back, we would get shares at group level. But this is something that we want to avoid, and before coming to this, we would probably try other means, including an extension of the carried period of our investment.
Okay, thank you, Dylan, for this answer. I have another question here. If a French company wants to expand internationally but doesn't have identified a target, would you be able to work with the French company to help identify this target?
Sure. So the answer is yes. However, the International Business Fund will not do the very cumbersome work of exploring target internationally. But what we can do, and what we do on a regular basis, is present to the French independent French businesses that are interested in carrying out a hunt mission for targets internationally. We introduce them to relevant advisors, and we can, in the event that the target search would eventually convert into an investment, we would carry our share of the advisory costs.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Another question we have: what do you expect from consulting firms, advisory firms? What is the typical way that outside firms work with you?
Well, it's definitely twofold. The first one is the one I mentioned. So when we are when we meet with independent businesses who are interested in going abroad in any geographies, we're currently building up our network as richly as possible in every country, in order to call advisors and make them enter the process as early as possible. So the first way is us calling advisors to help our independent businesses. And at the same time, advisory firms are connected to a very dynamic network of deals and companies, and we have had many first meetings with independent businesses originated by advisory firms, which have subsequently worked with us on the project, if a project emerged from this encounter.
Okay, very good. Can you share an example of a case involving a BPI investment in a US target under this fund?
Yes, we don't have closed any investment in the US yet, but we have really many examples of in a variety of sectors. So in terms of structuring the operation, it's pretty straightforward for most of them. It would be us plus the French company acquiring directly shares of the US-based target, but we've had targets in the many targets in the aerospace sector, many targets in the farming and food sector as well. And in terms of diligencing the project is pretty traditional, I would say. We mandated audit firms to perform the work. Maybe a particularity that we would be ready to explore is sometimes, if need be, we are open to let a third-party investor enter the structuring of the operation. So, for instance, we had a case in the United States where if it had worked, unfortunately it didn't work, but if it had worked, we plus the French company would have owned jointly 75%, and then we were open to a third-party investor owning the remaining 25% locally. And we're open to this for a variety of reasons, but generally speaking, it either reassures the seller that a local investor is willing to carry a share in his business, and we also have the case when the industry, the underlying industry, is government regulated, and usually we work with local governments to see if they if they're willing to enter the structuring and own a minority share alongside us to work together. So, but it's really difficult to just pinpoint one example because every case is different. But in the U.S., generally speaking, if I were to make conclusions, I would say that the most dynamic sectors that we've worked on here are either aerospace, farming and food, and also rail.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Another question here. If you exchanged your shares in the US target at the end of the agreed upon period against shares in the French parent, but the situation still does not improve, could you ultimately force the French company to sell itself?
It would be hard to, since we're minority investors, we wouldn't really have the power to do this. And it's definitely not what we're looking at. So my answer is no.
Okay. Another question here. How involved is BPIFRANCE in the initial due diligence of the US acquisition target? Do you rely on the French company's due diligence?
Usually we're very involved for two reasons. The first one, we like being involved. It's as simple as that. And the other one is that usually independent French businesses tend to undervalue the importance of, they tend to overlook the importance of external advisors. So there's usually a fair bit of education work to do on our end to persuade them to have recourse to external advisors. So usually we are very involved in originating the advisory part, and B, we are used to M&A processes with a variety of advisors and coordinating them also. We are usually pretty involved. And financially, and it's going to be my last point, as I was mentioning regarding the target research advisory fees, in case of a successful deal, we would assume our share of the due diligence fees corresponding to our ultimate share in the foreign-based target. So, for instance, in Poland, we assume 20% of the overall advisory costs.
Okay, understood. We have another question. I think you answered probably some of it during your presentation, but just to summarize, we have a participant who asked us, how do you determine if a French company is ready to go international?
Well, obviously there are mathematical indicators, and there's then a more general feeling. Usually, for us, for us, if a company exports a lot of good internationally, it means that they already have an international experience. So for us, this is a good indicator. So usually companies exporting over 10% of their revenue are able to qualify. And a second indicator would be companies who already have international based subsidiaries. And the third criteria will be determined when we actually meet with the French businesses, and we have very detailed discussions about their international strategy. And if we feel that they're mature enough, if their strategy is convincing us, this is the way we select them.
Okay, very good, thank you.
But usually, Jeremy, just to conclude this point, honestly, when a company has exports over 10% of its revenue and has at least one international subsidiary, usually it's a no-brainer.
Okay, understood. We have time for a few last questions. So I have a question here. Do you put a timeline for companies during the acquisition phase, as sometimes it may drag forever?
I'm not sure I understand this one. We definitely don't put pressure on the companies during the acquisition phase, and it's really the timeline of the acquisition is really not ours to decide, because there are two cases. It's either we are on a one-to-one negotiation base with a third party seller, or the process is a competitive auction process, in case of which the investment bank running the process imposes upon us a specific timeline. So, for instance, in the case of the Poland acquisition, it was on a one-to-one negotiation base, and it took really a long time. It took over 9 months, but we didn't put pressure on it. We really want the French company to remain, since they're majority investors, and since they often know way more than us, their market and the related targets, we really leave them in the driver's seats. And if they want our expertise and sometimes managing long processing negotiations, we are more than happy to help. But overall, we're not applying any pressure, and we're patient.
Okay, great. We have 2 or 3 minutes left, so I have a few questions myself. So I understand from your presentation that the International Build-Up Fund is able to will support some of the advisory costs, right?
Yep.
Okay, great.
So we started. It's really simple in mathematical terms, as I said earlier. The portion of the overall advisory cost that we support corresponds to our share in the foreign target. So if we have a 30% share in the foreign target, we will support and finance 30% of the overall advisory cost.
Okay, very good. Another question, is the International Build-Up Fund able to invest in greenfield slash VC projects?
Yeah, so the most vanilla example is obviously the one I presented, which is a traditional acquisition, but we are also in a position to perform the same kind of services whenever we're looking at either a startup company or a company that wants to enter a market in a greenfield situation. So maybe to illustrate that, we recently almost, and we will probably invest next year. We recently worked alongside a French company which wanted to enter the US market, and in order to do that, the company wanted to set up an industrial plant in Mexico, and it basically wanted to build the plant from scratch, and we were on board with the project, so we can definitely finance the creation of a production unit in a greenfield type of situation, in a market where there is nothing and everything to build.
Okay, excellent. We have one last question. Do you see any interest from French tech companies to acquire US-based data consulting agencies?
I'm running through the catalog of companies that we've met. Honestly, I don't believe we've come across that configuration yet. So it would definitely be something that we would be interested in looking at with them, but I don't believe we've had so many demands in that field yet.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Thank you. So we're back to the end of this webinar, and I'm going to switch to show the contact information. So here you can see on the screen the contact information of Dylan. Dylan, here, if you can if you want to email Dylan with additional questions, feel free to. Feel free to contact me also if you are interested in the French American Chamber of Commerce and membership in the Chamber and in our events and connection opportunities with our network. And also, I want to let you know that we will email the presentation slides to everyone for this webinar. So again, thank you to everyone for participating. A big thank you for lead Dylan, Laurence Bissonnier, for participating direct live from Paris with us and giving us such an insightful presentation. So thanks again, Dylan, and we look forward to everyone to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.